last two sessions we've been focusing on FDR, that colossus who dominated the landscape of America for 12 of our most formative years, difficult years, during which we went through two significant ordeals by fire, the Great Depression and the Second World War. They were years that shaped the backbone of our country, years that spawned the generation that Tom Brokaw referred to quite aptly as the greatest generation. And we've addressed two searing questions. First, what did he cure, if anything? Did he cure the economic depression? And second, why did he not cross the line to despotism, as had Percy Hammond in the film that we reviewed? Today we wish to focus on the year 1938. It was one of the most trying years of his administration, and we'll paint for you a picture of our country during the year 1938. It was a time when the economy went into a nosedive once again. Roosevelt had tried to balance the budget. It was a mistake. It was a time when, like poor Humpty Dumpty, all the restorative measures of the New Deal failed to put the economy back together again. It was a time when war clouds were ominously gathering in Europe, and Britain was unprepared, struggled against a stubborn populist movement did FDR here. Knowing that Britain was unprepared, he struggled against that populist movement, against our involvement, natural aversion to our involvement in foreign wars. FDR increasingly sensed that failure to support Britain at this juncture was a road to disaster, but his hands were tied by isolationist measures, some of which he himself, as a master politician, had aided and abetted. It had simply been a matter of political expedience at the time. We'll get into that in some length next week with the discussion of the Neutrality Acts and how they tied Roosevelt's hands. But 38 was a time when fear, both domestic and international developments, gripped our nation, but we shut our eyes and we were afraid to look. We'll examine this critical year, 1938, through the prism of radio broadcast, one that shook the nation, Orson Welles' infamous War of the Worlds. It was a metaphor of the times, the time of the perfect storm, the year 1938, an age of anxiety. In 1938, a wooden dummy captured America. Charlie McCarthy, dapper and pugnacious, sat on the lap of Edward Bergen and cynically philosophized over the radio about the foibles of his human counterparts, including Bergen himself. People loved it. The Charlie McCarthy craze swept the country. Dolls replicating McCarthy and his friend Mortimer Snurd now appeared everywhere we were, department stores, regular retail stores, in the newspapers, toy shops and whatnot. And the wooden dummy, though he couldn't clearly drink coffee, found that the Chase and Sanborn Company, one of the largest purveyors of coffee in the United States, had no trouble whatsoever sponsoring his radio show in the 8 p.m. time slot on Sunday night. That show soon overwhelmed all the ratings of the other networks. Particularly, it was estimated at that time that 27 million households out of a total of 34 million in the United States had radios, and of those, 97 million out of a total of 129 million listened. It was the sole direct channel into their home. Of these, it was estimated that 30 million tuned into Charlie McCarthy at 8 p.m. on Sunday night. Coffee sales were good. But at a competing network down the road, CBS, the producers of the Mercury Theater of the Air, which unfortunately shared that same 8 p.m. time slot with the dummy, were having a terrible time. They were desperately trying to compete, but they were losing the Crosley ratings at that time by something like 34-3. What to do? In a dramatic attempt to match WABC, the Columbia Broadcasting Company, hired a 23-year-old actor, director named Orson Welles. And they teamed him with a 34-year-old Bucharest-born former grain dealer by the name of John Houseman. You may remember him more recently from The Paper Chase when he played the Harvard law professor. Now, Welles had a deep, resonant voice, already created a sensation as the mysterious Lamont Cranston on the Mutual radio station's show, The Shadow. You may remember he starred in that from 37 through 38. You may remember the famous opening line, "Who knows what evil lurks in the heart of man? The shadow knows." Well, the voice was that of a 23-year-old Orson Welles. Houseman and Welles had worked together on a number of successful projects, one of which had created a sensation. It was under the Federal Theater Arts Project. They had put on something called the Voodoo Macbeth at a Harlem theater. Now, for that, they featured an all-black cast, including a genuine troupe of African voodoo drummers, imported with a witch doctor. They had added yet another authenticity, an air of authenticity to the program by reportedly sacrificing a goat in the basement of the theater. The Voodoo Macbeth opened to a sold-out house, together with 10,000 people hovering in the street outside. All of the New York critics loved it, all except one, Percy Hammond of the New York Herald Tribune, a right-wing critic, a right-wing paper at the time, penned as just another wretched example of New Deal excess. Now, Hammond, of course, contracted pneumonia the day after his article appeared and died within 2 days thereafter. Added to the horror of the Voodoo Macbeth and, of course, the Welles and Houseman. Well, now, Sunday night, October 30, 1938, All Hallows Eve, was something called Mischief Night. That was a night on which we kept a lookout for kids with soap where we were. It was awful to get that stuff out of your windows, out of your cars. You never left a car in the driveway. It was mischief in those days. It wasn't just simply trick or treat. It was more trick than treat. However, Welles and Houseman decided that they would use a different kind of mischief. They would stage a raid on a dummy's ratings by staging a dummy raid of their own, and this one on the entire United States. And it would emanate from the planet Mars, and it would track the famous H.G. Wells saga, The War of the Worlds. Now, Wells' work, which was published in 1898, right after his famous work, The Time Machine, was really a progenitor of the literary genre we now know as science fiction. It was a vivid dramatization of man's vulnerability to a superior alien intelligence, and the listeners that night proved particularly vulnerable. Since the Mercury Theater's ratings were so low, very few people tuned in when the program began. Most were, of course, listening to the dummy. Had they tuned into the Mercury Theater, they would have heard a perfectly perfunctory, rational explanation about what was about to happen. Namely, this was merely a dramatization of H.G. Wells' well-known science fiction classic. Wells' book, which had predated both the Boer War and the First World War, had envisioned a kind of Armageddon, both mechanized and chemical warfare, and it had already proven ominously prescient, as we had just lived through the First World War, where there were gas attacks. The Chase and Sanborn Hour had programmed numerous station breaks. Business was good. After the first Chase and Sanborn station break, however, 12 minutes into the broadcast, as Nelson Eddy began singing the Neapolitan love song, estimated that about 12% of the listening audience switched their dial. In those days, we did that. People did that. They switched dials on radios like you do on TV now, and then they switch back. They flipped their dials and unfortunately happened upon the Mercury Theater of the Air. The program was starting in a very simple way, but then began to develop in a devious way. The programming began with an innocuous presentation of the soothing dance music of La Comparsita, conducted by one Raymond Raquello, a Latin band leader, since confined to the dustbin of obscurity, coming from the Meridian Room of the Park Plaza Hotel in downtown New York City. Fictitious announcer named Phillips had been breaking into the dance music from time to time, at first with seemingly harmless announcements about reports from an observatory in Princeton about gases, citing unusual gases on the planet Mars. Who cared? And then back to the music. But then with increasingly threatening reports of sightings in New Jersey at a very real township of Grover's Mill, picked, it turns out, by random, by a producer punching a pencil at a map of New Jersey. And there really was at Grover's Mill. A listener just aimlessly flipping around the dial at that point would have heard this. Well, ladies and gentlemen, this is Carl Phillips again, the Wilma Farm in Grover's Mill, New Jersey. I hardly know where to begin to paint for you a word picture of the strange scene before my eyes. Like something out of the modern Arabian Nights. Well, I just got here having a chance to look around, but I guess that's it. I guess that's the thing, directly in front of me, half buried in a vast pit. Must have struck with terrific force. The ground is covered with splinters. A tree must have struck the tree on its way down. Splinters. What I can see of the object itself doesn't look very much like a meteor, at least not the meteors I've seen. It looks like a huge cylinder. The reporter was by this time accompanied by a fictitious Princeton astronomer named Professor Pearson, who added yet another air of authenticity to the developing drama. Wells technicians then played a sound device into the microphone, emulating the unscrewing of a gigantic spaceship lid. Actually, it was a crockery cookie jar being unscrewed in a toilet bowl. Petrified reporter Phillips proceeded to describe a tentacle squid-like Martian creature as it emerged from this capsule. Quote, "It's as large as a bear, and it glistens like wet leather. I can hardly force myself to keep looking at it. The eyes are black and they gleam like a serpent. The mouth is V-shaped with saliva dripping from its rimless lips, and they seem to quiver and they seem to pulsate." And that was the good news. The announcer and professor went on to describe the play-by-play as the Martian creature and its companions proceeded to unleash a devastating heat ray on a crowd that had gathered at the Grover's Mill Farm in New Jersey. Eventually, the ray was unleashed on poor Phillips himself. The signal went dead. Confusion reigned back at the radio stations, not unlike that during the very real Hindenburg Zeppelin disaster, which had happened just the year before and had been the first live disaster to be reported on radio. People remembered it. Not knowing what to do, the station now filled dead air with a piano interlude from Claire de Lune. This is an irony only that Wells and Hausman could possibly have dreamed up. Then came bulletins of death tolls. Grover's Mill, horrendous. Martial law was declared in New Jersey. Red Cross emergency units had been dispatched to the scene. Then the coup de grace. An announcement from the Vice President of Operations of the Columbia Broadcasting System confirming that strange beings were indeed the vanguard of an army from Mars. The army from Mars marched implacably toward New York City, easily defeating our army, spewing poisonous gas. Almost immediately following this came an inspiring pep talk from the so-called Secretary of the Interior of the United States, and his voice sounded just like that of FDR. Imploring his fellow Americans in doomsday tones to remain calm and to pray to God Almighty so that we may confront this destructive adversary with a nation united, courageous, and consecrated to the preservation of human supremacy on this earth, end quote. The easy defeat of our army was, of course, readily believable to many Americans, and the memory of gas warfare was still fresh in the minds of many. Moreover, the bulk of the public was already ready to believe from reports by such notables as Charles Lindbergh, Ambassador Joseph Kennedy, that Adolf Hitler was invincible, that our armed forces were woefully antiquated, which they were, and that we were totally unprepared for war. Suffice it to say that those who flipped their dials that night never flipped back to the dummy. Instead, they just flipped out. They were too busy calling relatives and friends, warning them to get away. Where to? Just get out. The Martians were releasing deadly gas, advancing on New York. Armageddon was at hand. Get away. Now there was panic in the streets, but this panic was for real. Men and women wept openly. People ran haphazardly into the streets, covering their faces with wet towels and awaiting certain death. Others drove crazily around, careening through stop signs and stoplights, oblivious to pedestrian traffic. Phones were jammed. Those who couldn't reach loved ones by the phone to say goodbye because of an overload simply assumed that an alien intelligence, a master race superior to our own, had managed to destroy our communication system. A Princeton University study 2 years after the event estimated that 1.7 million people felt the situation was real, and of those, 1.2 million panicked. That's a lot of panic. None of these bothered to switch stations to check. None looked up the radio schedules that day to see perfectly perfunctory announcement of what was going to go on. All had missed the announcement at the start of the Mercury Theater because no one was listening. Well into the broadcast, the station break didn't come until well into the broadcast because there was no sponsor. Most people were already off somewhere frantic and in a state of shock. Imaginations ran wild. People in the vicinity of Grover's Mill fired shotguns at a gigantic Martian rising high up on metal legs, like the legendary Don Quixote. They were fighting a windmill, but this windmill had been abandoned and had lost its fan. The ultimate irony, those shooting at it in Grover's Mills had lived there all their lives. Today, the windmill is a tourist attraction, especially attractive around Halloween time, particularly to Europeans. Cranberry Fire Department, 5 miles from Grover's Mill, received numerous reports of fires in the woods, all non-existent. Farmers with shotguns roamed the countryside looking for Martians. Hysteria broke out. Hospitals treated 15 for shock and hysteria. But the reaction wasn't confined in New Jersey. The word quickly spread throughout the country. Governor of Pennsylvania, completely taken in, offered troops to New Jersey to help contain the invaders. People in Boston crowded onto a rooftop and were sure they saw New York burning. Concrete Washington, out on the West Coast, the power failed. Coincidentally, just as the CBS Martians were interrupting communication lines on the radio broadcast. Mass hysteria followed. People fled into the streets and were cut off, of course, from the eventual station break that would have allayed their fears. Author Ray Bradbury tells this tale close to the alleged scene of the landing. A local at Grover's Mill area was in such a hurry to drive off to reach his wife's family in Pennsylvania, he neglected to open the garage door first. And despite his wife's screaming warning, drove right through the door with a crunch, shouting, "Well, that's all right, we won't need it anyway." Similar stories were legion. Bradbury tells another Grover's Mill neighbor who had emptied an entire bottle of whiskey during the broadcast, and he was so sure it was his last broadcast he wanted to save his chow dog. So he took the dog and wanted to heave him over the fence to his kennel outside. Well, the dog was terrified, grabbed a hold of his master's coat sleeve, clamped down with its jaw, and held on for dear life. The man swung the dog over his head, and the dog landed over the fence, safely on his kennel with the sleeve attached. Actor John Barrymore kept a kennel of 15 Great Danes on the West Coast. Upon hearing the broadcast, he opened the kennel and said, "Fend for yourselves." In Providence, the power company was so swamped with phone calls, they couldn't take them all. People wanted to shut off the lights so the Martians wouldn't find Providence. You could miss Providence. Church services instantly became a popular. Now prayer meetings, especially in the South. Closer to home, after a frantic search, they finally discovered my Uncle A.B. Hiding under the dining room table. Now, AB, of course, was a little bit strange, but in any event, church services now became Apocalypse Now prayer meetings, especially in the South. But another set of reactions was also discernible. Another felt that the Martians were either Germans or Japanese, prompting these erratic quotes. I knew it was the Germans trying to gas us all. When the announcer kept calling them people from Mars, I just thought he was ignorant and didn't know that Hitler had sent them all. And then there was the Trojan horse meteor variation. The meteor was just a camouflage. It was really an airplane like a Zeppelin that looked like a meteor. And the Germans are attacking us with gas bombs. Another, the poor Jews are being treated so terribly in some parts of the world, I was sure something had come to destroy them. And just before the station break, the script ended with a pathetic plea from a shortwave operator from some remote outpost. The 2X2L calling CQ. 2X2L calling CQ. New York. Isn't anyone there? Anyone on the air? Isn't there anyone? And then static. Well, later, as the program ended and the Mercury Theater signed off the air, the police charged into the studio, confiscated scripts, surrounded the actors. They didn't know what to do with them. Nobody had died as a result of this. No crime had been committed. At least they couldn't figure one that fit. Most of the injuries were bruised egos. The print media, of course, were very unhappy about the fact that radio was now moving in on their audience. They were merciless in their interrogation of Wells and Hausman, saying that hundreds of lawsuits were threatened. None materialized. For 3 days, the future of the Mercury Theater and the air hung in the balance, while executives at CBS tried to measure the fallout. They couldn't decide whether Wells and Hausman were the devil incarnate or the best thing since sliced bread. Then the tide turned. The Campbell Soup Company offered to sponsor the program. Wells and Hausman had become instant stars. The Mercury Theater was renamed the Cabell Playhouse, and it debuted 10 days later on December 9, 1938. The program continued in the air until 1940, alongside such programs as Jack Benny, Burns and Allen, and the Lux Theater in the air with Cecil B. DeMille. The fallout from the whole incident was perhaps best summed up by literary critic Alexander Wolcott in a telegram to Wells, which read as follows. This only goes to prove, my beamish boy, that all the intelligent people were listening to the dummy, and all the dummies were listening to you. But in historical retrospect, the incident's really a fascinating barometer of the time. USA, fall 1938. Perfect metaphor for our state of mind at the time. But why was this spoof able to send the shockwaves it did through the country, virtually paralyze our nation? Why were Wells and Hausman able to elicit such paroxysms of fear and frenzy from our listening audience? To begin to understand this phenomenon, it's necessary to explore the state of international and domestic affairs prevalent at that time and its effect on our national psyche. Now, first, there was an atmosphere of fear both on the domestic and international front. Second, there was an atmosphere filled with hatred. Third, an atmosphere full of forlorn hope and longing for heroes. And finally, there was an atmosphere desperately seeking panaceas to replace a seemingly failed domestic and international policy. First, the paralysis of fear on the domestic scene. On the domestic front by 1938, the hope spawned by the first 100 days of the New Deal, the prolific and widely hailed therapy to be administered by the New Deal, had worn off. The bulk of the New Deal programs, of course, were proving unsuccessful, at least in an economic sense. They simply didn't thwart the economic depression. And it was just a time of frustration, as evidenced by an almost irrational lashing out by FDR from above, in an unprecedented attack on the separation of powers and the Supreme Court, in a court-packing attempt which we discussed last week. From below, the economic depression, which had seemed to be lifting in 37, had actually reasserted itself with a vengeance. By March of 38, the stock market had again lost 1/2 of its value. Corporate profits dropped by 78%. Industrial production down by 40%. All of this resulted any hoarding of savings and a reluctance to spend on the part of the working public, which only served to exacerbate the dilemma. People were afraid they would be left to starve once again. What about paralysis of fear on the international front? The voice of the fireside chats, the voice that my grandparents connected with over a vast cultural divide, was a calm voice. It was a reassuring, reasoning voice. But during 1938, when the Mercury Theater of the Air took to the airwaves, people who got up at 4 or 5 in the morning and turned on their radios could listen to the report of another voice. This voice traveled intermittently, pulsing through static and the waves of the ocean. It was a mesmerizing voice, harsh, staccato, compelling, rising like the roll of drums, building to a crescendo. It was the voice of Adolf Hitler. And then would come unending frenzied shouts. His fanatic followers had been worked into an hypnotic rage. They would follow this charismatic psychopath into the Götterdämmerung, if need be. And many on this side of the ocean quietly thanked God that there were those waves between us, but we weren't easy or afraid. For the key to that ocean was the British fleet, not our own diminished and antiquated World War I battleships. And some, like FDR, knew that the hegemony of that British fleet was now imperiled. More of that next week. All of this, of course, helped build the atmosphere of fear. On October 30, 1938, when Wells and Hausmann took to the airwaves, Adolf Hitler's star was in the ascendancy. You know, there was a great German scholar named Franz Neumann who wrote a book called Behemoth. And Neumann once remarked that had Hitler died in the year 1938, he would undoubtedly have gone down as one of the greatest German statesmen of all time, rivaling even Frederick the Great. At that time, Hitler's star was in the ascendancy. Only 30 days before the War of the Worlds and the famous broadcast, Czechoslovakia had been sacrificed by Britain and France via the Munich Pact in England that September. As Hitler raged on, making increasing demands on Czechoslovakia, signs of war, panic abounded. Gas masks were being handed out in the streets. Trenches were being dug in Hyde Park. There were lines around the American embassy, around the block from the American embassy, people seeking visas to come to the United States. We actually got some of those school children from Britain at our school in Cleveland that were evacuated. School children being evacuated in the countryside. This was in 38. On Saturday, September 29, 38, Hitler met in Munich with Chamberlain and Daladier. The latter, of course, collapsed, capitulating to Hitler's demands, succumbing to his empty promises, virtually surrendering Czechoslovakia. Oh, theoretically, it was supposed to be a plebiscite. Of course, there never was. Chamberlain returned to England as the conquering hero, proclaiming victory in our time. But Churchill denounced Munich as a defeat without a war. We had to make a decision between shame and war, warned Churchill. We've chosen shame, and the result, we shall receive war. But Hitler, of course, feeling his oats, retorted, once and for all, we request to be spared from being spanked like a pupil by a governess. Churchill's warnings, however, were already proving prophetic only 1 month later as Wells and Hausmann took to the airwaves with their drama. The seeds of fear were already planted on this side of the Atlantic. Hitler's apparent invincibility was becoming legendary not only in Germany, in Europe, but in the United States as well. German-American friendship committees sprung up here throughout the country. T.H. Watkins, historian, reports that there were over 800 fascist and openly anti-Semitic groups in the United States in 1938. Eventually, the German-American Bund, under its leader Fritz Kuhn, would hold a standing room-only rally attended by over 20,000 people in Madison Square Garden. Churchill was in disgrace in England for denouncing the Munich Pact. In October, FDR, like Churchill now, also rebuked Hitler. He was in a radio broadcast, and he rebuked him for shattering his empty promises in Europe, in Munich. FDR pointed out quite rightly, that instead of the plebiscite, what had happened is the Wehrmacht had simply marched in, taken over Czechoslovakia, taken over the Skoda works, and basically there was no more Czechoslovakia. The events in Europe had unsettled the American public. Then FDR his pointed rebuke of Hitler just weeks before had frightened many Americans. An increasingly emboldened Fuhrer had just fired back at FDR for meddling where he didn't belong. And many now feared FDR's remarks would provoke a war with Germany. FDR's talk had angered others, particularly the growing group of isolationists led by Gerald Nye of North Dakota in the Senate, and of course now avowed Nazi sympathizers at that time included such influential notables as Charles Lindbergh, Father Charles Coughlin, Ambassador Joseph B. Kennedy. Moreover, FDR's attempts to aid victims of Axis aggression by amending the Neutrality Acts, which prohibited the export of arms to the Allies in case of war, had met fierce opposition in Congress. In all, there was a pervasive tension and a nervousness about things military, foreign, and beyond our control. All of this was undoubtedly reflected in the frenetic reaction to Wells and Hausmann's wild radio creation. Turns out we've been misled, just as the principal players in Munich had been cleverly misled by the Luftwaffe. The so-called state of art of the German Air Force in 1938, described by Lindbergh to Ambassador Joseph B. Kennedy, was in fact a myth. In reality, the German Air Force at that time was small. The bulk of it was obsolete. Documents and reports by the German Air Command, which surfaced after World War II, revealed the Luftwaffe at that particular time was undergoing a major overhaul, and it was not in a condition to fight either the French or the British. William Shirer concluded that had Britain and France gone to war with Germany at that time, they would have undoubtedly won. But the lone eagle, Lindbergh, both willing and gullible, had unwillingly played a part in grossly overestimating German air strength. He had been wined and dined continuously by Hermann Goering and the Luftwaffe and other members of the German Air Command. They had sent him on a carefully programmed tour of German factories, hangars, and airfields. They showed him a number of Henkels, Focke-Wulfs, Junkers, Messerschmitts, allowed him to fly some, including a Storch trainer, and he was very impressed with the maneuverability. It turns out that most of the hangars he saw from the air were empty. Most of the planes he saw on the ground were wooden models. The numbers of serviceable German aircraft, which were not obsolete, had been exaggerated by 300%. The production of German aircraft, which he estimated at 8,000, was in fact 3,000. Tragically, Lindbergh's misleading reports to Joseph Kennedy and to French Air Minister Le Chambre eventually found their way to Chamberlain and Daladier, and were a major factor in French and British capitulation in Munich. Lindbergh was so taken with the German people as a race that, and the master race theory, that he wanted to make Germany his permanent home. He was rewarded by Field Marshal Hermann Göring on October 18, 1938, just 12 days before this broadcast, with the Service Cross of the German Eagle brimming with swastikas, by order of the Fuhrer, an award which he wore proudly on a number of occasions and which Anne Morrow Lindbergh came to call the Albatross. This was the same decoration, incredibly, which had been awarded and accepted by Henry Ford only 2 months before that. All of this mythical military and air supremacy with which our country had been bombarded played its part in the shock treatment administered by Wells and Hausmann. What about events that preceded the Anschluss in Austria, which of course took place then, and the Munich Pact, 38. Starting in 36, following Hitler's bold march into the Rhineland unopposed, curiously enough, the American public had witnessed the meltdown of anti-nationalist forces in Spain. Before a coalition of conservatives and fascists, despite the activity of our own Abraham Lincoln and Washington brigades, which had been roundly defeated. 1939 finally saw the crowning of Generalissimo Franco's dictatorship, and Hitler and Mussolini played a significant role in that. We sat silent, presumably helpless, as the Italian fascists invaded and overwhelmed solitary Ethiopia. On the other side of the globe, we witnessed Japan invade and subdue Manchuria for its national resources in 1931. And then in 1937, emboldened, we saw war break out in earnest between Japan and China. Rumors of atrocities too horrible to describe were circulated here. They were pictured, however, in grisly technicolor in war cards that we kids used to buy down at the local transit station when they ran out of baseball cards. Had the same awful tasting bubble gum with it. But there were these grisly pictures of the rape of Nanking and other things. We were introduced to the war that way as kids. And in 1938, the USS Panay, a ship on the Yangtze River there to protect American citizens in China, was sunk by Japanese warplanes in a bloody foreshadowing of Pearl Harbor. The emperor apologized, but the American people was uneasy about Japan from that time on. These events, which long antedated Munich, were precursors as well of our state of mind as Wells and Hausman took to the airwaves. Americans desperately needed a hero. They got one. 2 days after the War of the Worlds, a horse named Seabiscuit, bow-legged and malformed underdog, conquered the seemingly invincible war admiral in a one-on-one at Pimlico. The public erupted with joy. It was a sign of the times. But only 5 days after that, reality set in, as the flames of hatred in Europe were fanned once again. In Paris, a 17-year-old Polish-Jewish emigre named Herschel Greenspan, distraught over the forced incarceration of his Jewish relatives in Germany, shot and killed Ernst von Roth, the third deputy of the German embassy. Nazis, under a fake cover of official warnings against anti-Jewish excess, looted Jewish shops, burned synagogues in Berlin, as they had burned those in Nuremberg before, and began the deportation of over 60,000 German Jews to concentration camps in what became known as the Night of the Shattered Glass, or Kristallnacht. Many Americans shuddered as the news broke, did nothing. FDR expressed surprise and shock that anything such as this could happen in the 20th century, temporarily withdrew our ambassador from Berlin. Nothing came of it. Hitler simply responded in kind. The world remained silent. At an international conference on Jewish refugees called by FDR at the French resort of Evian, the rest of the world, with the exception of Denmark and Netherlands, refused to afford any of them sanctuary. Even America's quota remained fixed at 27,370. Congress wouldn't budge. Hitler, emboldened by this reaction and by the world's silence, went on, of course, to perpetrate one of the greatest genocides in the history of mankind. And so, as this began, the levels of anxiety here rose yet another notch. And then there was hovering over the mindset, listening to the War of the Worlds, the mystique and fear of Hitler's Übermensch, the so-called pure Aryan master race. It was a mythical concept hypothesized in the pseudoscientific writings of Viennese Guido von List at the turn of the century, and other fanatic occult mystics who influenced Nazism, Count Gobineau, George von Schonerer, and of course that had all been celebrated in the popular operatic ring cycle of Richard Wagner, Nordic myth. All of this had unfortunately played a significant part in formulating the demented Weltanschauung of the struggling young artist Adolf Hitler in Vienna during the years 1906 to 1913. According to von List, the Aryans were from a continent near the North Pole and had been driven southward by the Ice Age, where they unfortunately mixed with inferior types. They were of a superior intelligence, destined by God to rule the world. Well, Hitler's recent meteoric rise and the success of the German takeover, first of the Rhineland, then of Austria, now of Czechoslovakia, had strengthened the myth of Aryan invincibility and conditioned the minds of a number of listeners on All Hallows Eve 1938 to the myth of a superior intelligence here on Earth or elsewhere. One of those so predisposed, although not a listener at the Mercury Theater that night, was Charles Lindbergh himself, who had not even finished high school, but now fervently embraced a pseudoscience known as eugenics, and had even become a scientific colleague and co-author of its chief proponent in the United States, Alexis Carrel. Now, Carrel was a former Nobel Prize winner turned fanatic. Much to the dismay of Anne Morrow Lindbergh, he had come to dominate the life of the Lindbergh family so thoroughly at one point that Lindbergh had moved his entire family to the small French island of Iliac off the coast of Normandy, where they lived in isolation with Carrel, who exerted a stranglehold over their lives akin to that of a cult guru. Carrel's book, Man the Unknown, published in 1933, had sold 900,000 copies, topped the New York Times bestseller list for nonfiction. In its final chapter, quote, entitled The Remaking of Man, Carrel actually advocated that defective individuals and criminals be disposed of by society in, quote, small euthanistic institutions supplied with gases, end quote. The book not only found a following in the United States, it was immensely popular among Nazi racial hygienists, so much so that Nazi scientists and physicians on trial for euthanasia in Nuremberg after the war claimed in their defense that they were merely conducting experiments formulated in the United States by Alexis Carrel. Lindbergh was of a mind with Carrel that Western democracies were in a phase of deterioration. Hitler, of course, perceived the War of the Worlds broadcast as just another example of that deterioration. Lindbergh was enamored of Carrel's advocacy of racial betterment through selective breeding and sterilization, and clearly thought that the Nazis enjoyed racial superiority. These factors were much in evidence in Lindbergh's misinformed contributions to a joint report on German air power prepared together with his close friend and ally, U.S. military attaché in Berlin, Truman Smith, in November 1937. That account, echoed in Lindbergh's later report in 1938, which was so influential in Munich, spoke in a hyperbole of a miraculous burst in German aircraft production, which Lindbergh attributed to the scientific skill of the German race in achieving this fantastically large air force. All of this racial superiority mythology was swirling around the heads of our bewildered public when Wells and Hausman took to the airwaves. What about the atmosphere of hate to which I refer? Conspiracy theories abounded. Many concerned the alleged communist menace and came to be associated by their proponents with the New Deal. The Dies Committee, eventually renamed HUAC, had veered sharply from the path for which it had been set up, which was the investigation of fascist inroads here. It now focused instead on New Deal creations such as the Federal Theater Project, which we saw, which had given Wells and Hausman their start. The German-American Bund, German-American Friendship Committee, the Silver Shirts, the Knights of the White Camellia, the Ku Klux Klan, and similar hate groups abounded in the United States, flourished seemingly unimpeded, lauded the work of HUAC committee, even though they were called before to testify as window dressing. Anti-Semitism was rampant. Father Charles Coughlin, the radio priest of the Radio League of the Little Flower of Jesus, preached to over 30 million listeners and had been humiliated in the elections of 1936. Following that humiliation, he now dropped all pretense and turned to rampant anti-Semitism. Now, Coughlin, who had started out as a crusader, a social crusader, often in the populist image, began to praise the German-American Bund and William Dudley Paley, who was the head of something called the Silver Shirts. The mysterious and totally mad Paley once testified before the House Un-American Activities Committee that human beings choose their parents by our own free will before entering life as infants. He was totally mad, this man. As Coughlin began to disparage FDR, however, his following lesson began to leave the mainstream and gradually grew into a fanatic personality cult. He concerned his activities concerned the Vatican. They sent the then Papal Nuncio, Pacelli, later Pope Pius XII, to Washington to make sure that they would monitor Coughlin. Coughlin would not upset the Democratic coalition, Labor, Solid South, and the Catholic vote. Coughlin's program shocked and dismayed much of the Catholic clerical community, the lay community, and their parishioners. He was eventually remanded to his parish in Royal Oaks. Hatred was not confined to the Jews. An anti-lynching bill had been introduced and then reintroduced since the year 1935. The bill finally reached the floor of the 75th Congress on January 6, where it was filibustered against endlessly by Senators Bilbo and Ellender from Mississippi and Louisiana. Now, ultimately, they defeated the proponents of the bill as cloture votes in mid-February failed to obtain the needed two-thirds majority. They openly preached a doctrine of white supremacy and racial hatred. FDR, the consummate politician, afraid of Republicans making serious inroads into Democratic strongholds in the Deep South, refused to actively support the anti-lynching bill, just as he had refused to actively campaign to increase German Jewish immigration quotas. Amidst all the darkness, there came a glimmer of light, a glimmer of hope for the black community. On Easter Sunday, it found a hero in singer Marian Anderson. On Easter Sunday, she sang in front of the Lincoln Memorial before a crowd of 75,000. When Anderson had been denied permission by FDR, by the DAR, to sing in Constitutional Hall, Eleanor Roosevelt and Harold Ickes had beseeched Roosevelt to allow her to sing at the Lincoln Memorial. Eleanor had just resigned from the DAR. FDR granted the permission. She sang. Harold Ickes introduced her with the following words, quote, "When God gave us this wonderful outdoors," said Ickes, "and the sun and the moon and the stars, he made no distinction of race, creed, or color. Genius, like justice, is blind. Genius draws no color line." After that, Anderson was brilliant. The concert was magic. Thousands of African Americans rushed forward to greet her, touch her hand. There were tears in the eyes of most. Amidst the gloom and repression of the era, the black community had found a slim ray of light and its hero. Eleanor Roosevelt, in one self-effacing, poignant gesture, had succeeded in restoring the faith of the black community in FDR, despite FDR's faltering on the anti-lynching bill. So an atmosphere of fear, an atmosphere of hatred, of forlorn hope, of longing for heroes. What then of the panaceas we sought so desperately? The 1930s admittedly witnessed the worst prolonged economic depression in our history. Nonetheless, during the decade, no fewer than 4 U.S. cities chose to sponsor World's Fairs. The fairs were a tranquilizer for a frightened generation. In Chicago, the Century of Progress exposition opened April 29, 1933, on the shores of Lake Michigan. It was attended by 38 million people. Its theme, ironically, to demonstrate man's power to prevail over the perils that beset him. The Texas Centennial Exposition in Dallas and the Frontier Centennial Exposition in Fort Worth opened on June 6, 1933, ostensibly to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the state of Texas. They were an immense success. When they closed 6 months later, over 7 million people had visited and contributed handsomely to the economy of the state of Texas. 3 months after the War of the Worlds broadcast, San Francisco's Golden Gate Exposition opened, and only 1 month later in Corona, Queens, the enormous 750-foot spike Tryon, thrusting defiantly to the future, and the globe perisphere symbolizing world togetherness, debuted to great fanfare at the New York World's Fair. The theme was the world of tomorrow. The New York exhibit all looked to the future with great hope, great exhilaration, as if we needed relief from the gloom and doom of the tenuous economy and the explosive world situation. But only 1 month before the New York World's Fair opened, Hitler had marched on an unprotected Bohemian Moravia, which was all that was left of Czechoslovakia. 3 weeks later, Italy invaded Albania. In 4 months, Germany and the Soviet Union, on August 23, 1939, would sign a non-aggression pact. Only a week after that, of course, on September 1, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. Britain and France joined the fray. And although something of a lull ensued for a short period, it came to be known as the Phony War. As the World's Fairs came to a close in June of 1940, bombs were falling on London. The Benelux countries and France had now fallen. All hopes for a magical elixir of peace had now vanished. The country was looking for panaceas, building myths, dreaming of a world of tomorrow, trying to envision it as a world of peace and brotherhood. But it knew full well that the European continent was moving inexorably toward war. T.H. Watkins quotes Richard Reinhardt, a producer, as saying of the Golden Gate Exposition, "The fair had been a sedative, a tranquilizer for a frightened generation. We had understood this and accepted it with gratitude. We welcomed our brief oblivion and clung to our elusive innocence as long as the spell would last. In a world consumed by rage, there would be no further respites, no more innocent islands." So the War of the Worlds was shocking, it was sensational, it was cruel, it ultimately proved a commercial success for its sponsors. It was also a perfect metaphor for the time. It was a time of domestic paranoia, spawned by the apparent failure of the New Deal to cure the economic depression. Mayor's fear that we might starve again. This, coupled with increasingly perilous developments abroad, served to engender that very fear of fear itself, the conundrum that had highlighted Roosevelt's most famous inaugural address in '33. It was a time in America prompted by events in Europe, and particularly by the meteoric rise of Adolf Hitler, projected onto its fear of the unknown the chimera of a superior intelligence, a superior race. It was a time when a number of people listened intently, albeit fleetingly, to crackpot theories of eugenics, of sterilization, which had already enveloped and enslaved much of Middle Europe in the muddle of hate. And it was a time when America looked on in horror and, assuming it was helpless, shut its eyes to the wholesale slaughter of innocents which it knew was taking place abroad. It was a time when the humanistic ideals of the New Deal years were coming under increasing attack and often succumbing to the minions of hate, to the Fritz Kuhns, the Charles Coughlins, the Bilbos, the Martin Dyes, precursors all of the McCarthy excesses of the late 40s and early 50s. It was a time when Americans desperately reached out for heroes, and some found them, although briefly, in an underdog horse with an indomitable will to win, and an underdog contralto with a magnificent voice and an unquenchable spirit. And it was a time when Americans built fairs, sought panaceas, dreamed of a future which lay beyond their reach in a world they knew was about to shatter about them. This then was the America that Mars captured for one unforgettable hour on All Hallows Eve, 1938. Thank you. We're open to questions for anybody. We have a roving mic. We're glad to hear from you.
I was surprised to learn that eugenics was practiced in northern Canada.
Yes.
All through the 1940s. Is this correct?
I'm not entirely sure of that, but I can tell you of one thing. There was an exhibit, and that's about Vermont. There was an exhibit at the Mass MoCA about 5 years ago, about a professor, I believe his name was Perkins, in Vermont, who had actually preached eugenics in Vermont, all kinds of charts, sterilization of people, and Vermont had actually passed statutes adopting a number of these things at that time. It was pervasive in the United States. I don't know about Canada, perfectly possible. It's very difficult for us to realize in this day and age how prevalent those concepts and theories were at that time, that they were. And you can search that out. There was a lot of it going on at the time. It's amazing.
They had concentration camps for the indigenous people in northern Canada.
In northern Canada, is that right? Tell us about it. It's something I didn't know about.
That's what I had read about, and I don't know, more than just reading that, but this was practiced all through 1940s.
That's amazing. Now, I didn't know that. I'll have to look it up. But thank you for bringing it to our attention. It's amazing what went on, isn't it? Yes, I think there's one on.
I wanted to say that the International Center for Photography.
Take the
The
mic.
International Center for Photography about 3 or 4 years ago had a huge exhibit on eugenics all over the world. I mean, this is not just a recent phenomenon, it's been going on for centuries in one way or another. But it was a marvelous exhibit and a very sad one.
Yeah, I remember seeing the front cover of Time magazine not long ago, Time magazine in the mid-30s, with a picture of Alexis Carrel and Lindbergh on it. It was a very popular theory at that time, and the book sold 900,000 copies at that time. It was an enormous number of books, and these theories abounded at the time. And of course, the Nazis who were on trial in Nuremberg defended based on the fact that they'd been reading Carrel and Lindbergh. Lindbergh, who'd never gone to high school, never finished high school in any event, was suddenly teamed with Carrel as a guru in this stuff. It was an amazing period of time. And of course, he was a great hero in the United States, and he had a lot of influence here. At one time, it was theorized he might even run for president. Very difficult situation. Any other thoughts? Next week, we're going to get into Churchill and Roosevelt. Oh, yeah, please.
I think we have to constantly be on guard of our prejudices that arise to unbelievable levels. There was a man that responded to a request by the United States government to find out what are the qualities of an individual to make him economically successful. And what they wanted to do was to bring up the economic level of the black community to the rest of the country. They were lagging behind, and his name was Jenkins, and he was at Harvard. And there's a fellow on the West Coast at Stanford. He was a Nobel Prize winner. I forgot his name. It was Shockley was his name. He wrote a treatise based on the IQ examination results and surmised and brought up a hypothesis that black people are inferior intellectually. And there was a big to-do. He was invited to Howard University to speak, and they wanted to know, they were very angry and all that.
Of course, what's interesting there, incidentally, is Hitler had many of the same thoughts. Exactly. And the Lewis versus Schmeling fights in 1936 and 1938 were rife with that kind of propaganda coming out of Nazi Germany. And the Nazis at that time felt the same, that the black race was an inferior race and so on and so forth. And when Schmeling defeated Lewis in 1936, he was flown back to Germany by Graf Zeppelin. They wouldn't let him come back slowly on the Bremen as he was scheduled. And he became the great hero of the German Olympics and was wined and dined throughout the country. Of course, when he lost to Lewis in 1938, in less than 2 minutes, was knocked absolutely cold, the Nazis turned their backs, and no one greeted him when he came back to Germany. He was, in 1936, the great Aryan, the great Aryan who had defeated the inferior race. In 1938, he was totally forgotten. It was a very interesting point.
There was a talk by a pediatric neurologist who said one of the most difficult things for the human being brain to learn is to be able to face another person who has totally different points of view and who looks totally different than you are, and be as comfortable with them as they are with someone who you're used to being around.
Thank you very much. It's been, anybody else got any other points here? Yep, there's a hand up over there, I think.
I don't understand what you mean by the rules in Vermont.
I can't quite hear you.
The rules in Vermont, what specifically were they? They didn't allow marriage between certain people? Or?
Oh, yeah, what they wanted to do was eliminate, quite frankly, by euthanasia. They wanted to sterilize, this is what they wanted to do. They wanted to sterilize certain kinds of human beings based on facial characteristics, other characteristics, genetic characteristics, believe it or not. It was a question of sterilization. That's what they were focusing on in Vermont. They had actually adopted certain statutory stuff with regard to that at one time. According to the Mass MoCA exhibit, and I believe the name of the fellow was Perkins, it was about 5-6 years ago. It was an extraordinary exhibit at Mass MoCA. Yeah. Yes?
I wonder if the audience knows that the Clarks, who left us this beautiful museum that we all appreciate so much, had definite Nazi sympathies at the time.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch your question.
They had Nazi sympathies at the time. The Clarks were Nazi sympathizers.
Who were? The Clarks? Well, I don't want to talk about the Clark in his own museum.
We love the museum.
Sterling Clark, someone last week gave me a piece about a so-called business plot on FDR, which had, quite frankly, mentioned Sterling Clark, although it was never proven that he was involved in it. But this isn't the place to discuss that. Seriously. Any other points here? Any more hands up? I want to thank you all. It's been great having you. Next week, we're going to be talking about Churchill and Roosevelt, their clandestine relationship during the Gathering Storm. Thank you all.